Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Mehboob Haq Distinguished Lecture Series, and one that I'm particularly excited about and have waited to host for a very long time. This session is brought to you jointly by the Mehboob Haq Research Center at LUMS, the Pakistan Hub at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK, Ideas, which is the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives, also in Pakistan, and the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan. I also wanted to mention that this is the 106th session of our wonderful platform, LUMS Live. My name is Shandana Khan Mumand. I am a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK and an associate fellow at Ideas in Pakistan. I will be moderating today's conversation with my colleague Hassan Javed, who is an associate professor of sociology at LUMS. The aim of the Mehboob Haq Distinguished Lecture Series is to provide an opportunity to learn from the work of leading scholars on 21st century global and national challenges. And I couldn't be happier to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Pradeep Chibber is Professor of Political Science and the Indo-American Community Chair in India Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He studies the politics of India and political parties and party systems more broadly. His recent research is on the influence of ideology on party system change, religion and politics, elections and parties, and the politics of development in India. He received an MA and an MPhil from the University of Delhi and a PhD from UCLA. His books include Religious Practice and Democracy, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014, and the more recent Ideology and Identity, the Changing Party System of India, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2018, which he co-authored with Rahul Verma. In this book, he takes a historical look at India's changing party system since 1952 and suggests that we think about the politics of ideology and of identity most centrally in our understanding of what has otherwise been called a patronage democracy. This is what he's going to talk about today, and he has suggested that he will present a comparative view of populism in India in the 1970s and that which we see today with the rise of the religious right. I have wanted to have Pradeep speak about this for a long time because his unique and incredibly knowledgeable insights on India can help us understand the rise of populist politics and leaders, not just there, but in many parts of the world today. And for those of us following politics in Pakistan, we know that the question of party systems is on all of our minds today. These are phenomena that we need to understand, and Dr. Chibber is incredibly well placed to help us do that. His talk today is titled The Rise of Populism in South Asia. Pradeep will present his work for about 40 to 45 minutes, after which we will open up for discussion, drawing on questions from the moderators, that's Hassan and I, and our audience today. As we go, please post your questions through the chat function. We'll be able to see these, and we'll pick up on these after the lecture. So over to you, Pradeep.
Thank you so much, Shandana, and it's a pleasure to speak at LUMS, even if it's virtually. And I've been wanting to speak at LUMS for quite some time. My close friends and neighbors, Salman and Samreen, are, alums. So I think there's one reason for that. And the other reason, of course, is that LUMS is a great institution, which one has only admired from far. I'm not so sure that I'm going to live up to all the things Shandana has said, but I will speak about and I will try to do the best I can. I also have this rather awkward tendency, and I want to start by saying this, is that rather than present work that's already done, I'm going to present work that I'm thinking about right now so that I can get feedback both from the interlocutors and the discussants here, Shandana and Hassan, and more importantly from the audience, because this is very much a work in progress, and any insights you have would be really appreciated. Of course, I'll try and set it in some context and talk of party politics in India, but that's my plan for the day. So I'm going to now share my screen. So if you don't see me, I'm still here. It is not a bot that's speaking. So let me begin by, the brief I was given was by Shandana, and I take these things seriously, was to speak about right populism in South Asia. And I'm going to speak mostly about the BJP and in contemporary India. And the other brief I was given was to speak about democratic backsliding. And that's what I am planned to do today. So let me begin. Narendra Modi comes to power, and we all know this, in the 2014 national elections in India, riding a populist wave. It is well acknowledged. Lots of people have written on this that it was a populist moment in Indian politics. But Modi is not the first populist in South Asia. And I dare say this is not going to be the last populist in South Asia today as well. And I think it's going to be quite some time before we see the end of populism. And this is something we can get to at the end of the conversation. South Asia actually has more populists than many other regions in the world. And I'll show you some data shortly, that the South Asian region is characterized by many, many populists. And India has not only national level populists, as Modi is an icon, Indira Gandhi was a populist, but many regional populists have been extremely successful in the Indian states. Here are some examples. There was M.G. Ramachandran in Tamil Nadu. There's N.T. Rama Rao in Andhra Pradesh, and Mamata Banerjee contemporaneously in West Bengal. There's Arvind Kejriwal in Delhi and now in Punjab, who's a populist par excellence. And then, of course, there's Yogi Adityanath, who, whether his recent successes in the Uttar Pradesh elections in 2019 were due to him or the BJP and Modi remains a question. And it's also questionable whether he is the populist. But the fact is that he's living under the shadow of the prime minister. So regional populists exist in India. And when you look at this South Asian global perspective, and this is from VDEM, which collects data on these things. And when you look at this bar chart, what you realize is that South Asia, which is the third bar chart from the right, has the highest number of populists in the populist index, which is created by VDEM. South Asia is the highest number of populists. And the index scores higher than any other regions in the world, higher than Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, North America, East Asia. So South Asia is well known for its populists. And so what I'm going to do today is try and explore why this populism exists in South Asia. And I'm going to focus largely on the Indian case, though I think the parallels to Pakistan will be obvious to anybody who's following them. Our view and my view, and this I'll talk about why this is our view rather than my view, populism is a successful political strategy, and populism is a political strategy in India and maybe in other parts of South Asia, and this will become apparent to all of you who are following along, because of the argument goes as follows: the failure of the post-independent state to live up to its promises to redress political and economic inequality. So the first claim we make, this is from a from a book manuscript I've co-authored with Adnan Nasimullah. The idea is populism is successful because the post-independent state fails to live up to its promises to redress political and economic inequality. When India and Pakistan become independent, the state claims that its first and foremost task is to redress political and economic inequality, and that's to some extent is because of its colonial past. It needs to address that, and it fails to redress that. The failure of the state to address political and economic inequality leads to the rise of left populists, both in India and Pakistan at the same time. Bhutto and Indira Gandhi, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and Indira Gandhi. And what the left populists do, and I think this is an important point I'll return to, they inject the state as a solution to inequality. So in the period leading to the 1970s, the mid-60s, 1970s, depending on where you draw the line, the state was present, but it was not as present in daily life. But what the left populists do is they inject the state as a solution to inequality. However, injecting the state as a solution to inequality doesn't really redress the inequalities. The inequalities persist. Economic reform transformed this, and I'm going to borrow Hamza Alavi's term, this overdeveloped state into a site for rent seeking and corruption. And this creates the condition for the rise of right populists. So to rephrase what I'm saying, the contemporary rise of right politics in India can largely be attributed to a historical pattern in which the state sets out to achieve a mission of providing equality. The state fails in its mission. The left uses that failure to build political support for its process of reforming the state. In that process, it increases the role of the state in the economy, in the political and social life of citizens. Economic reform transforms this overdeveloped state into a site for rent-seeking and corruption, which creates the right conditions for the rise of right populists. So contemporary populism in South Asia, in some senses, has its origins in the promises of the post-colonial state and the politics of left populists. That, in a nutshell, is the argument. And I'm going to now try and develop this argument in some detail. There's also democratic backsliding happening both in India. And I think democratic backsliding, and I will say this, is a feature of populist regimes, whether they're left or right. And the reason it's a feature of populist regimes, left or right, is because the task they set out to achieve is impossible. The task they're setting out to achieve is they're going to use the state or not the state or some other ways to actually reform deep patterns of social and political inequalities. And no elected government can do that in a span of a few years. In fact, not even an authoritarian government can reform a society in a few years. Social change is remarkably slow and arduous. And the task they set out to achieve is impossible. And since most populism depends on a leader, the image of the leader needs to be protected. However, the extent of democratic backsliding, and this is a double-edged sword, depends on three things. First, the extent of control a populist has over the security state, the strength of the political party upon which the political power of the populist rests, and finally, support from social organizations, a theme I'll return to in the end. So in other words, there may be democratic backsliding, but the democratic backsliding depends on these three factors. Okay. This talk today is based on a manuscript with Adnan Nasimullah called Righteous Demagogues, and a book and articles with Rahul Verma, mostly Ideology and Identity, which Chandana referred to. Okay. So to restate what I've said, right populism has come to the fore in India. And I'll leave you to think about the Pakistani case, largely because of historic reasons, because of the failure of the state to live up to its original moral contract of providing social and political equality. It is that failure that provides the conditions for right populists to come to power. How much democratic backsliding they can indulge in depends on their control over the security state, the strength of the political organization, and the support they have from social organizations. That, in a nutshell, is the talk. If you've heard this, and if you want to go to sleep, you're free to do that now, or go have a meal, or whatever you choose to do. Now, let me work this argument through and provide you evidence that what I'm saying is indeed what's going on. So the outline of the talk is as follows. I'm going to talk briefly about the party system transformation in India between 1952 and 2019, as that was a part of the brief I was given. I'm then going to speak about the BJP's contemporary electoral dominance and show you good data that the BJP is indeed a populist party in the sense that it's gaining support from lots of groups of people. I will define populism. I will speak about the moral contract, what we mean by the moral contract. I'll then go over the left populism of the 1970s. I'll speak about what happens when you liberalize an overdeveloped state, how the middle classes get really unhappy with the corruption and rent-seeking that's prevalent in this overdeveloped state. And finally, I'm going to conclude with what happens when right populists come to power. That is the outline for the talk today. So let's begin. The party systems of India. And this is just a brief introduction to acquaint everybody with where we are and why do we find ourselves in this position. So if you look at this slide, the Indian political party system is normally defined to have gone through four phases. The first phase, which is the top left graph, is the first party system in India in which the little red dots are the right. And you see that the right is quite fragmented. And the dark blue dot is the Congress party, which sits in the center of Indian politics. And the lighter blue dot or greenish dot is actually regional parties whose ideology is very akin to that of the Congress. They're not very different from the Congress. That's our ideology. Now, I just want to get two things out of the way. First, there is no conventional left-right distinction in India. And there's a very pragmatic reason for it. The pragmatic reason for it is that in a country as poor as India, no political party can afford to be anti-poor. To be anti-poor is political suicide. So no party, even however fond you may be of free market politics, or however much you may be beholden to capital or business interests, you cannot be anti-poor. So you cannot play on the standard left-right divide, because that argument carries no water with the voters. So in a poor country, you really need to walk away from the politics of the standard left-right, rich-poor. What divides Indian society, and this is the argument I made in the book with Rahul Verma, is two things. First is, what role should the state play in social transformation? And what role should the state play in controlling property rights, which is what we call the scale of statism, which goes on the y-axis from top to down, from top to bottom. And the second debate, which if you read the Constituent Assembly debates of India, is all over those debates, which is, should you favor recognition for minority groups, Muslims, Sikhs, Dalits, other backward castes, or should they be one set of laws for everybody? And here you get odd bedfellows. You get people who are on the extreme liberals, such as Meenu Masani, in the Constituent Assembly debates, rather or all groups of all kinds of people who are classic liberals, want all citizens to be treated the same, whereas others want that there should be a special group recognition. And that's the other axis of tension which exists in Indian politics. In other words, there's one axis of tension on, should the state actually be engaged in social transformation, which is it the job of the state to transform society? And there are people who believe that it is the job of the state to transform society. There are other people who believe it is not. And there are some groups who believe, which is the axis on the left-right, which is, is it the job of the state to actually promote the identities and interests of groups, or should the state treat everybody equally? And in the latter group, you get both the Hindu right as well as classic liberals coming together, because for different reasons, they believe all citizens should be treated the same for their own political reasons. So those are the axes on which this political conflict was taking place in India. And what's happened over the years, and as you look, is that the right has consolidated, and the right is consolidated in the BJP. And we can talk about why that is the case. And over the years, especially from 2014, the BJP has expanded, and it has expanded enormously. So when you look at the bottom right panel, what you see is there's a consolidation of the right and an expansion of the right. The Congress party, which is the dark blue, has shrunk, and the regional parties are now the main opposition party for the BJP. And these regional parties are actually the ones that favor more recognition of minority groups, and at the same time would prefer an active role for the state in social transformation. So the Indian party system is characterized by these debates, which are less about economics in the classical sense of, should you actually be pursuing pro-rich or poor policies, for a very simple reason, that nobody can afford to be anti-poor in a really poor society. That's political electoral suicide. Now, having said that, what's happened to the BJP? Is the BJP really a populist party, or is it just a Hindu majoritarian party? And there's robust debate within Indian academia on that. People who study Indian politics have gone back and forth on it, but let me just show you some data to speak about the fundamental transformation that's happened in the support base of the BJP since the 2014. So what do you find? First, just to get some things off the table, if you will, is the BJP's electoral dominance. So I'm just looking at national elections, not state elections. So in 2014, the BJP contested 428 seats. It won 282 seats. Its vote share nationally was 31%, but the vote share in the seats it contested was 40%, 39.6%. And the number of seats it won with more than 50% of the votes is 136. And the mean margin of victory was almost 17%. In 2019, its performance was actually, quite frankly, quite spectacular. It got 37.4% of the vote nationally, but 46% of the vote in the seats it contested, which is shocking in some levels, because that level of dominance hasn't been seen since the Congress Party was running India in the 1950s. It won 224 seats with more than 50% of the vote, and its vote margin was almost 20%. For those of you who study party politics in Pakistan and observe it, know that in multi-party competitions, especially in constituencies where there's more than two parties, which is the case in many parts of India, even though there are two main parties, there are lots of smaller parties that are competing. A 40% vote share is sure to get you many, many seats. And in fact, even at its very heyday of Congress dominance, the Congress's vote share never crossed 40-some%, except in the 1984 elections after the assassination of Indira Gandhi, when it got much larger share, but that was a sympathy vote. So just keep in mind that the BJP has done really, really well. Question is, why has it done so well? And I think it's done well because there are lots of people voting for it. Why is that the case? And I just want to go through this chart, and I just want you to bear with me for a moment as I go through the logic for putting this chart together. So this chart is mostly based on survey data from the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, or Lokniti. And what we do is, on the extreme left is the sample of voters. So this one is looking at caste and communities. Others, which are normally the upper castes, are in dark blue. Muslims are in orange. Scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are in gray. The yellow is the other backward, caste, my bad. The dark blue is others, which is at the very bottom, are people who are neither Muslims, nor scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, nor OBCs, nor upper castes. My apologies, which was Sikhs, Jains, Parsis, etc., people who don't identify themselves in any of these categories, and the upper caste are in light blue. So when you look at the sample of all voters, which is on the extreme left, says 21% of the voters were upper caste, 31% are OBC, 22% are scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, about 15% are Muslim, and the remainder are other groups. With the second column is the traditional voters of the BJP. The traditional voters of the BJP are, if you look at the very top, largely upper caste, because 30-some% are upper caste. 40% of the OBCs also vote for among the BJP voters, 40% are other backward castes, 18% are Dalits, 2% Muslims, and about 5% of the others. If you contrast the second column with the fourth column, which is who are the new BJP voters who came to the BJP only in 2019, you realize that the number of people who are moving towards the BJP are more from the lower segments of society. In other words, they are the ones who are transitioning to the BJP. And this is not as common with caste, but if I show this to you with class, it's even more surprising. Here, upper middle classes are at the very bottom in dark blue, middle classes are the orange, lower middle classes are in gray, and the poor are in yellow. And when you look at this data, look at the extreme left columns again. 31% of the population in the survey is poor, 34% is lower middle class, 22% is middle class, and the remaining are upper class or upper middle class. The traditional BJP voter is indeed, and if you look at this carefully, the second column, the traditional BJP voter is indeed more upper class, right? Because it's almost 20% of the BJP's vote share is from the traditional upper classes. But the middle classes also vote for it, and a large share of the BJP's vote is traditionally coming from the upper classes and the middle classes. But move to 2019 and 2014, what's happening? The BJP's vote base is expanding. It's lots of poor people and lots of lower middle class who are now supporting the BJP. So that's the transition that's happening. In other words, the BJP is expanding its caste basis. It's expanding the communities that are voting for it. It's expanding the number of poor people and lower middle class people who are voting for it. And of course, it is also expanding the number of rural voters who are voting for it. The BJP was in 2009 mostly getting support from the urban groups, but by now it is getting large amounts of support from rural areas as well. And finally, of course, and this has become really important in the 2022 UP elections, women have started voting for the BJP. For a very long time, the BJP had a significant gender gap. And in fact, I remember working with a colleague of mine, Professor Deshpande from Pune, on looking at the gender gap and trying to find the reasons for it. But right now, more women are actually voting for the BJP, and there is very good evidence that the 2022 elections in Uttar Pradesh, the BJP won largely because of the large vote share it received from women. So, cut a long story short, the BJP is getting support from lots of people. And the question is, what is going on here? Why is this happening? How is it that a Hindu right party, a party that is mostly upper class, a party that is mostly upper caste, managed to expand so dramatically? That's the question we are all trying to figure out. And the answer, of course, is populism, right? That's the answer I'm going to give today. But the question, of course, is what is populism? And Adnan and I define populism in a very particular way. We say populism is an ideologically infused political strategy that evokes moral claims about the subverted obligations of the state to its citizens to build a coalition of diverse and even opposing political interests by forming a new political party or transforming an existing one in order to achieve power. Many, many words there, long definition, but let's go through the basic parameters. First, it is a political strategy. It is a political strategy that evokes moral claims. It says the state had obligations to its citizens. It is not meeting those obligations. It uses that strategy, that ideologically motivated strategy, and that criticism of the failure of the state to build a coalition of diverse and even opposing political interests. And it does that by creating a new political party or transforming an existing one. So Chandana, who's interested in party systems, as I am, in fact, this is something Adnan is pushing us to do, and we will work on this if we get to that phase, on how populists actually transform party systems. Is something people who study parties haven't spoken about, that how populism actually really transforms the nature of party politics in deep and fundamental ways. And we can see this across the world, with Moreno and AMLO in Mexico, to even Trump in the United States, where he's actually fundamentally transformed the Republican Party in ways, which are problematic to some and exhilarating to others, depending on your political perspective. So that's what they do. That's what populism. But the question, of course, is, what is this thing called the moral contract? What is that? And the argument we make is that the moral contract, as far as both Adnan and I are concerned, is that at independence, the post-colonial state said that the purpose of the state and its leaders was to serve society, and they were going to dismantle structures of inequality and deliver equity, and social justice to its members. That's what the state said it was going to do. It said, we have this obligation that we're going to do this. And if you read the debates on independence, and you read the debates in the Constituent Assembly, and you even read the debates in Pakistan, both during the formation of the early constitutions and debates, it's very clear The idea is we are going to create a more equal society. We are going to create a society that will provide social justice and equity. And that is a very fundamental idea, if you will. I'm going to put my foot in my mouth behind creating an Islamic republic, because that's what it's going to do. Democratic governance, therefore, in South Asia is that there is political obligation of the state to restrain the most odious inequities and unfair practices of governance. And let me give you what does that mean. And this is where we take a step in a slightly different direction, that the state in India, and I'm going to focus on India, I'm going to leave you to think about the Pakistani case as well, actually is not a state that generates equality. It is not a state that treats everybody equally. And in fact, there are two pieces of evidence that are really striking. The first is from a paper I wrote many moons ago with Amit Ahuja. We were interviewing people in rural India, and we were asking them, why do you go to vote? Because if you believe standard political science arguments, why would somebody vote? Well, I'm going to vote because I'm going to draw some benefits, right? But the problem is that if the state isn't doing anything for you, why do you vote? And this person said, if I do not vote, I'm dead to the state. And then even the state of democracy in South Asia, which is the surveys of what's happening in South Asia, say very clearly, why do people vote in South? What do people in South Asia equate democracy with? They don't equate democracy with freedom. They don't associate democracy necessarily with liberty. They associate democracy with removing unfairness, removing inequities. And that survey evidence is quite compelling, both in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. That's the main thing that's drives democracy. Democracy is not associated with some fancy idea of attaining individual personhood, but it's associated with removing the inequities that exist in society, especially the political inequities, and they expect democratic governments to provide fairness. And that's where I think the state has really failed. Okay. So since I have about 15 minutes left, why is a populist claim centered around moral claims successful? And let me now run through the argument pretty quickly. Why is that successful? In the immediate independence and post-independent politics, India was characterized by what I would call a mostly absent state. There is good work coming out by historians which says even though the state existed at the very top, and the state had presence in, the high, with these policies for industrialization, with setting up elite institutions at the ground level, the state was mostly absent. And the state was run, as many people have argued, Pranabardhan notably, was run by capitalist bureaucrats and landlords. These are the people who were running the state. In India, the emphasis for bringing people on the ground was through community development programs. Those community development programs were a gigantic failure. For 20 years, there was no real community development at all because there was a myth that people would come together and all of a sudden the country, the rural areas would be transformed somehow magically, right? In this context, the urban and rural poor are seeking equality. They are the one, they say, listen, we want more equal treatment. What is happening? Because nothing has changed for us. Independence has come, a state has come, there's democracy, but we are not getting any equal treatment at all because in those community development schemes, everything was still being run by the landlords and the upper castes. That was the first claim. And then I'm going to just say something which I like us to think about and return later, is that the small industrial sector and agriculture at this point, especially after the post-Green Revolution, is seeking credit. They want money. They want money to run their businesses. They're looking for credit. And there is no credit available because the banking sector is in the hands of large private players. So what happens? In this context, the left populism of Indira Gandhi comes about and stresses the politics of equality. It says there's bank nationalization, there's nationalization of the insurance industry. What do? They make possible the idea that all of a sudden money can now be given from the state to people who want it. So in this case, India precedes Pakistan by about 15 or 20 years. Small-scale industrial development, corporations are set up, money is directed towards small industry, and money is directed towards agriculture. The moment you have state-owned banks, you can actually direct those banks to actually give money politically to sectors that need that money. So in other words, you address the issue of credit for these sectors, which is something that they were yearning for a long time. Indira Gandhi also transforms party politics. She splits the Congress party and creates a new political party centered around Indira Gandhi. It was called the Congress R and is now called the Congress I, which we're all familiar with. But the most significant change, I think, was the expansion of the state to redress inequality. And in my view, and not in my view, the big change that happens was that the state now really becomes overdeveloped. So to use Hamza Alawi or to evoke him, I think the state wasn't as overdeveloped in the times when he was writing, but post 70s, in Indira Gandhi's period, and I think in the case of Pakistan Bhutto's as well, is when the state really becomes overdeveloped. Why? Because instead of removing inequality, the social and economic conditions of inequality, which may be very difficult to do, what does the state do? State power becomes a source. State says, I am going to inject myself into this. And I will be the one that's going to provide the resources that are needed to address the inequalities that exist. But instead of doing that, because of the nature of state power, the state itself becomes a source of social and political inequality. Right? So to me, the fundamental transformation that happens is that this is the transformation that happens in the 70s, that instead of, if you will, in good old leftist terms, there are no more class politics, but the state is now interjecting itself as the agent around which people are going to compete. But the state doesn't. And the moment that happens, the state, of course, because it has all the power and resources now, becomes a source of social and political inequality. As a consequence, there is sclerotic economic growth and the failure of this model of development. You get a balance of payments crisis in 1991. Economic liberalization follows. And of course, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out if you have an overdeveloped state, a state in which lots of people have a stake both in the transformation of money, in the transfer of money, and people have a stake in the regulation of money. If you introduce economic reform, what's going to happen? You're going to get lots of rent seeking and corruption. It just follows naturally. So the introduction of neoliberal reforms in this overregulated economy or state-dominated economy generates opportunities for large amounts of rent seeking or corruption. This, of course, creates what is well known, and this has happened in India, which is pretty well established, that the state's promises to remove inequality are now stymied by this corrupt political bureaucratic class. We are all familiar with this in South Asia. And you get an anti-corruption movement led by the middle classes, where the middle classes are saying, wait a minute, this system is completely unacceptable. There's too much corruption, and what we need is to have a completely new system, right, in which this corruption is completely gotten rid of. You get the rise of these middle classes, and the sentiment of this anti-corruption is captured by right populists. And what they say is, we will provide equality, but through efficiency. In other words, what is the problem of inequality in India? The problem of inequality in India exists because the state has become corrupt, because there are people in the state who are appropriating the resources that are meant for the poor for themselves. What I'm going to do is provide you a more efficient government. And because I'm going to provide you a more efficient government, you will realize that you will get what is due to you from the state. So that's the transformation. That's the rhetoric transformation they undertake. And in 2014, Modi stresses efficiency. Good or bad, right or wrong is not the point. The thing is, the model is, there's the Gujarat model of development, where we are going to produce efficient government that will make the state grow. Arvind Kejriwal from the Aam Aadmi Party stresses efficiency in anti-corruption politics at the same time, which is, I'm going to provide you an efficient system, right? So efficiency becomes the name of the game. And of course, this efficiency works really well for a certain class of people. And it works really well for a certain class of people because the middle classes love the idea of efficiency. Right? The support base of these right parties is the middle classes. And they think, wow, all of a sudden, and the middle classes are skeptical of a bloated, corrupt state. So they say, wow, this is totally cool. All of a sudden, we're going to have an efficient government. Of course, reforming the state is difficult because the state, it's easier said than done. And the state, which is a source of such massive inequality, cannot in a period of 4 or 5 years reform itself to become an engine of efficiency. right? India and Pakistan are not going to transform themselves into, the stereotypical Denmark in 4 years. Maybe it's possible, but I don't think it's possible. And the argument goes that for 2019, then, given the failure of this populism, BJP turns to political majoritarianism or nationalism for the 2019 election. And this is a political majoritarianism, which is focused largely on reflecting the political interests of the majority community against all kinds of minority communities. And this is delinked explicitly from religious practice. And in fact, in this paper with Rahul Verma, we observed that people who were practicing religion were actually walking away from the BJP at this point because of its political majoritarianism. And that's a mantle, as we will see later, has been picked up by the Aam Aadmi Party, which is populist, and Arvind Kejriwal, but he's out there as far as expressing his religiosity is concerned, even much more so explicitly than the right-wing BJP. So that's just an interesting twist for us to keep in the back of our minds. Okay. What about right populists? How do they stay in power? Right populists stay in power largely through a beholden bureaucracy, and this leads to centralization. So power in the right wing is exercised through a bureaucracy. This is what's happening to the Aam Aadmi Party to the BJP in Uttar Pradesh as well, where during the height of COVID, Yogi Adityanath, the chief minister, was running COVID policies with 9 bureaucrats. There was not a single politician involved. So many right populists run their centralization through a beholden bureaucracy, and this is true of left populists as well. And they focus on efficient delivery of welfare programs. That's all they're focused on, right? Somehow we're going to deliver this, and the rhetoric of efficiency works because the right populist base is really suspicious of the state, right? And that's where we are contemporaneously. This also can lead to democratic backsliding. Democratic backsliding can take 3 forms, and I would just want to talk briefly about this. First is the politics of efficiency, which is if there's a trade-off between efficiency and democratic norms, efficiency wins. For instance, in debates on privacy, the state argues that it's necessary to monitor the individual behaviors, because once we monitor individual behaviors, we can efficiently target the delivery of public goods. The second kind of backsliding that happens is the use of state power, especially the investigative and tax bureaucracies, to undermine the political opposition. And this has happened before in India as well. This is not new, but this happens before as well. And the third form of backsliding is placing the putative interests of one community, in this case, a section of Hindus, over other interests. And this impetus is, I think, coming from its ideological roots, not necessarily its populism. And of course, in conjunction with this is the politics of vigilantism, which is the government just looks the other way when vigilante groups who are associated with it are engaged in violence against minority groups. And I think there's some of that as well. So there is indeed democratic backsliding, but the democratic backsliding takes these 3 forms. And the reason it takes these 3 forms is, and I think this is something we should think harder about, is I think because of the nature of the institutions in South Asia, both in India and Pakistan, I think is that there is institutional weakness, and as the states get captured by certain groups of people, it's much easier to use the state as an instrument for democratic backsliding than in other places where institutional norms may be stronger. So what are the possible challenges? And I'll take 2 more minutes to right populists. First, what are the possible challenges to right populists? First is, of course, regional parties. And in India, I think they are posing the largest challenge to the BJP. Mamata Banerjee in Bengal being a very good example. They're not a democratic icon. She is indeed a populist who can challenge the BJP on its own turf. And there are regional parties in the south, and regional parties, even more extreme right-wing parties like the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra that are actually, and the NCP that are actually challenging the BJP. The other thing, of course, is the Aam Aadmi Party, which has done really well in Delhi and now had spectacular success in Punjab. They're also a populist party. They focus on education and health, and very explicitly focus on education and health. That's what they focus on. But the Aam Aadmi Party's politics, at least, is suffused with Hindu religious symbols and Indian nationalism. In fact, to an extent that's actually surprising. So in other words, there are 2 kinds of opposition that can come to the right populist of the BJP kind. One is from further from the right, and the other is from regional parties. Okay. So let me conclude. The failure of the state, I think the reason we get right populism in India is because of the failure of the state to uphold the moral contract. And this sets the stage for populist revolts. Contemporary right populism in South Asia flows from the earlier policies of left populists. If you don't understand what left populists did, you will never understand why right populists have come to power today. And some of the democratic backsliding and maybe even populism, and this is something that's open for discussion, we see today in South Asia is because of institutional capture, because these institutions of the state have always been captured by particular interests. And because they've always been captured by particular interests, it's not surprising that even the right populists are pulling a playbook from the same pages. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've taken 45 minutes, so my apologies for going a little bit over. And I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
That was brilliant, Pradeep. Thank you so much. Hassan, would you like to jump in?
Yes, thank you very much, Pradeep. That was a wonderful talk. There's a lot to think about, and I'm sure a number of issues will come up in the discussion. I'm also aware that we have some questions in the chat box as well. But first, I wanted to ask you to expand a bit on what you concluded with, namely the future of Indian politics. I mean, how do you see India's party system and its politics evolving as a result of these broader ideological shifts that have underpinned the emergence of right populism? I mean, the sense I got at the end of your talk was that in a way, the only option now, or the only visible option right now, is that everyone becomes a right populist. You see the BJP being outflanked from the right, but is that really the only possible alternative? Or has something fundamentally changed about Indian politics? And kind of related to that, what's the future of the BJP itself in a potential post-Modi dispensation? Just how important is the figure of the populist himself in this particular moment? So I just wanted to start with that.
Thank you. Great questions. And let me take the first one. And some of it is just the nature of the talk and the nature that I got hurried. So I think I should answer your first question. I think there is, and I've been struggling with this for a while, which is what kind of a message will a left populist come up with? Okay, so first let's step back and ask ourselves two questions, which is what is a right populist? So there is one kind of right populist is the BJP's right populism, which is now centered around a kind of political majoritarianism. And I think what people like Arvind Kejriwal are doing is just using religious symbols without an anti-minority language at all. So all he's doing in some sense is saying, I'm religious, but I can also deliver on welfare. So, in other words, it is, and I perhaps misspoke, he's not further to the right, but he's just expressing his religiosity openly so as to undercut any claims that the BJP may have over a Hindu religious identity. But he doesn't utter, his language is not anti-minority in any way, shape, or form, not anti-Muslim, nor anti-Christian. He doesn't do that. But he expresses his religiosity quite openly. That's the first. The other thing that I think is happening, and this I think is, if you think a little bit in the historically over the last 70 plus years, is when the Congress lost. The Congress didn't lose all of a sudden. It lost because it lost little pieces. And if you ask me, the challenge to the BJP is not going to come from a national alternative, which is what everybody seems to hope for. But I think it's going to come from little bits and pieces where it's actually going to gradually lose support. So for instance, if Uttar Pradesh politics indeed becomes two-party, not now, but in 5 years from now, think a little bit longer than one election, the BJP will no longer be able to win large majorities there. You go to Bengal, the BJP is being successfully challenged by Mamata Banerjee. In Maharashtra, the BJP is being successfully challenged. So these challenges are going to emerge locally. Once those local challenges emerge, you will enter, I think, BJP will no longer win a majority. That's, if you ask me to project, there will be coalitional politics will follow because of the nature of India. And then you will get the rise maybe of we don't know what, but that's 20 years down the road. But to me, that's where the challenge is going to come from. And I see that happening, but it's not going to happen overnight. That's how the Congress lost. It took a long time for it to collapse, and it is now collapsing because it's the regional oppositions that are actually going to deliver force, because that's where the politics is. That's the first thing. I think for the BJP, it is going to be difficult to replace Modi. And I think it is going to be a real challenge for them, because to some extent, he has a Teflon coating. And that's what's scary to the BJP about Arvind Kejriwal, because Arvind Kejriwal also has a Teflon coating. He can pretty much do what he wants to do. And I think that's what he's more worrisome than other people. And I think if you watch what happens in the Aam Aadmi Party is making forays into Gujarat, and if it manages to unseat the Congress in any way, shape, or form, I think we are in for an interesting election. Maybe not 24, but by 29, definitely there will be a transformation on the ground. But to me, that's the answer. I don't think the BJP can walk away from its reliance on Modi. It's not going to be easy.
Pradeep, you very convincingly told us about this shift from the left populists of the 1970s to the right populists that we're now seeing. I was wondering if I could ask you to shift this longitudinal view to a comparative view, and does that and to describe India in comparison to the rise of populism, or your current thesis, which I find very convincing, and I really enjoyed listening to it. But to what extent does that explain the rise of populism in other countries? Because what we're seeing in India is happening elsewhere as well. But to what extent do you think your thesis of understanding right populism now in connection to left populism of before, and the fact that they're structurally linked, to what extent does that hold in other places as well, do you think?
So, because I have to sell an argument, and I'm going to say this, right? We have to make the argument, and I don't know, I should stop being so candid. I think we have done some work, and I think I will let Adnan, who's not here, deal with the Turkey issue. But I think, for example, it works, we think, in Mexico quite well, where the rise of the Morena and Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO as he's called, is to some extent a similar kind of phenomenon, where he's saying that, listen, the politics of statism as led by the existing dominant party, the PRI, has failed. The state-led mission has not delivered what it was supposed to deliver, and he continuously evokes the Mexican Revolution and Mexican independence as his crutch in some senses to build support for his own argument of a new kind of politics. So what it does is he evokes, we argue that he evokes the past, he evokes this moral contract that the Mexican state had ostensibly made with its citizens when Mexico gains independence, number one, right? Especially not independence, especially after the revolution. Second, he has to create a new political party, which is called Moreno, because he realizes that the existing party structure cannot actually deliver what he needs it to deliver. So we think that works. And I think to put my foot in my mouth, I think the argument we are making is that similar phenomenon can also be seen in the case of Turkey with the AKP, right? So I think there is some argument out there that this works. And in the back of our head, what we are trying to do, quite honestly, is figure out why these populists are emerging in many parts of the world. But we needed to put some scope conditions. And India and Pakistan are a lot easier for us. And even though I've spoken about India, the book actually, and I'm going to say this so people can ask questions, and you can ask questions if you want, and we can discuss it. We think the echoes, we draw in parallels to Pakistan right through the book. And in fact, the manuscript deals both with Pakistan and India in equal measure, talking about how the failure of the state in Pakistan in the 50s and 60s creates the rise of Bhutto, how Bhutto sets in place a set of policies that are now make possible, right, the rise of crony capitalism with Nawaz Sharif, and that leads to the rise of this politics of discontent, which allows the PTI to come to power. So
I think on that, Hassan, if you don't mind, I'm going to go to Ali Chima's question, because that connects directly to what you've said about the parallels with Pakistan and with statism.
Right.
Ali's question, he's thanking you for an excellent talk, where he's a main claim of the talk is that economic statism is central to populism.
Yes.
But cities that have been the arena of populism, at least in Pakistan, have seen a systematic withdrawal of the state from service provision, the privatization of services, and the regulation of the city economy. So hence in cities, we find a reduction in statism coexisting with a rise in populism. And how do you reconcile this finding with your main thesis?
Let me now think about this, which is that much of the argument, if I'm hearing it correctly, is that, listen, in cities, and I'm going to rephrase this while I think about a clever answer, if I can think of one, which is that in cities, the state is withdrawing, and it is in cities that the populists are actually getting most of their support, right? And the question is, first, I do not know what's happening in the case of Pakistan at all. So since I haven't done any field work there, but let's think of and I'll speak briefly about the Indian case, where also the BJP gets enough support from urban areas, especially new smaller towns where there are few provisions that are being provided. The state is mostly not really present in delivering services. And my argument would be that, and here's where we may have to think about this a little bit. My argument would be, as I think about this, is that in these cities, what you find is that there is still the presence of a state, in the sense you still need the state to regulate things. That the state may not be present in actually providing, let's say, security. The state may be absent and you may have your own private security guards, or you may have privatization of electricity services, for example. But you still need the state, for example, I don't know about the Pakistani case, but the Indian case for Delhi, you need the state to provide education. The state still runs schools. The state still runs hospitals. The state is still regulating your economy. There is income tax inspectors, there's education inspectors, you need certificates from the state, you need to interface with the state for property taxes, for all kinds of things. And I think even though the state is withdrawing in a macro sense, at the micro level, you still have to work with the state. You need to get many things done. You still have to go to the state. Maybe you don't have to go to the state for a telephone anymore, but you still have to go to the state if you want to engage in any kind of property transactions. And if you need to go to the state for any kind of transactions, you want a state that is much more efficient. And somehow the mission of a populist that, listen, I'm going to provide an efficient state works for people's minds. And I think it, in some senses, dovetails with the idea, with the belief, right or wrong, that the private sector is more efficient. And therefore, we can live with the efficiency of the private sector. We think the private sector is more efficient. Because we think the private sector is more efficient, we want the state to reflect exactly the same kinds of things. And we think that a populist who promises efficiency, which is what right populists do, will work. I hope that answers your question, but that's the best I can come up with without having done field work in these places.
Hassan, should we go to Asma's question, or would you like to ask another question?
We can do Asma's question first.
Go ahead, Devin. Do you want to pick up on that?
Yes. So one of my colleagues, Asma Faiz in political science, asks, your talk convincingly mentions the altered character of the Indian state from absent to overdeveloped. Can we expect this transformation to be ad hoc in some sense? That is, with the removal of the populists, the structure changes as well. And she gives an example from Chavez to Maduro's Venezuela.
Could we just think about that again? So what would happen if you move from?
Can we expect one of the arguments you made was that the state in a way becomes more overdeveloped as a result of the actions of
interventions of the 70s, yeah.
Yes. So can this transformation be expected to be ad hoc once the populist is removed, or once any populist leader is removed? The changes they bring about to the state, can they be expected to be temporary, or are they likely to be enduring?
So the big issue is, what are the changes they are trying to make? So in other words, we had this overdeveloped state, and the state was very regulated. The state was involved in all kinds of regulations and delivery of services. And I'm going to speak mostly about the Indian case, where I know a little bit. What has happened since Modi has come to power? If you think about it for a moment, many of the public sector undertakings still haven't been shut down. The state is still engaged in, still has lots of public sector employees that are engaged in various activities. In other words, the state is involved, even though the state is gradually being moved away from being involved in distributive activities. And the state still has a very large role to play in regulating the economy, and the state will continue to have a role to play in infrastructural development. Both in India needs infrastructure development, and the state needs to play an important role in infrastructural development. Even though the state may not actually be involved itself financially, it still needs to regulate that infrastructural development. And in fact, many people have argued that the rise of big business in India is largely because its involvement with the state in building infrastructure, and that there is a symbiotic relationship between large business and this transformation, the building of infrastructure in India, roads, dredging, shipping, ports, etc. But I think Asma's question is bang on in one interesting way, which is that can a populist actually engage in a systemic transformation of the state, or will there be an element of ad hocism because of the nature of the populist enterprise itself, that it is centered around one individual? Okay. And that's the real tension. So in other words, and that the answer to that, quite frankly, lies in the extent to which in the case of India, how much of this is Modi and how much of this is the BJP. If the BJP itself as a political party is involved in this transformation and transition, you may see a little bit more of it. And if you see a little bit more of it, it's possible that other populists like Arvind Kejriwal may tag along. But there's, Asma rightly points out, there's also the danger that this may just come to, it may just fall flat. Because once Modi goes, he has to happen eventually, right? What happens then? And that remains unclear. But I think if there is a political party behind this, which is a strong political player, it may stay. And I think in the Venezuelan case, what happens is that everything was centered around Chavez and now Maduro rather than a political party. And I think that I think is also an important distinction between India and Pakistan, in the sense that the PTI doesn't have the same organizational strength, if you will, as the BJP right now. It is a well-established political party with deep roots in Indian society. And I think there's also lots of people who are hanging on to it right now just to come to political power. But I think and so I think the answer lies in to the extent to which there is a party behind it. And of course, the extent to which the party can actually engineer a transformation in the way people are thinking. And the longer, in fact, Modi and the party stay in power, it is likely that this transition may be more permanent because it is not as ad hoc as if it was just centered around one individual. I hope that answers Asma's question. If not, she should email me and I'd love to talk to Asma about this.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, I just wanted to jump in quickly. Is I think what Asma is also pointing to is the fact that if we make structural arguments, then we're saying that this structural transformation that we've seen up to this point is going to continue to produce populists.
Yes.
But you are asking us to also then consider the influence and role of party systems and the extent to which parties then develop. So I'm going to ask you to help us separate between a few different ideas that sort of seem to come together. And I'm sure I'm asking this on behalf of a lot of our students. So one is this sort of relationship that you've already alluded to between the populist leader, but these political parties that seem to be sinking in roots through them to some extent. And we've seen that both in Pakistan, but clearly you've already mentioned that it's happening in India. But two other points, sort of connected concepts that I wanted to ask you about is one, to what extent is polarization an important part of populism? Are these the same thing? Do they work in the same direction? Does one depend on the other? Or are these essentially different tendencies that we seem to be seeing playing side by side in the way politics is configured right now? And then connecting a little bit to what Hassan sort of started with at the start was, if we talk about the politics of inequality, then where do we draw the line between what is essentially programmatic politics for the poor and what is populism by this definition that you've presented? Where should we draw the line there?
Could you say a little bit more about the second one, please?
So the second, so it's connected to your idea that they're all sort of connecting up. I mean, between programmatic politics. So where we want policies change for the poor, and a lot of what you mentioned also during Indira Gandhi's time, the sorts of changes that were implemented even there, and the pro-poor politics. Very often we'd be tempted to put this into the basket of programmatic politics that is responding to the majority voter and the median voter. But you're now asking. I'm wondering to what extent we are now recasting that as this particularly South Asian version of populism. So what may be programmatic politics somewhere else, we're saying because everybody has to play this politics of equality and the left-right divide doesn't hold, that it's sort of coming into this basket of populism then.
Okay. So let me answer the second one before I forget, because I do forget. So I think I'd like to make an important distinction there, because I think the politics of welfare, which is what we would call, which is why Modi has done really, really well in 2019. And according to some people, Aditya Nath, according to my fieldwork, did well in UP. Jury's out on that. And Arvind Kejriwal did well in Delhi, is that I think is not what I would consider at the heart of the populist politics. And the heart of populist politics is the belief that the state is not going to, is the idea that the state will, and this is my view, and this may be somewhat controversial, is the idea that the state will treat everybody with equality, both socially and politically. And because remember, in India, the axis of conflict ideologically are not about economics. They're about the extent to which the state actually should be involved in the process of social transformation. Should the state be recognizing groups? And it is at its very heart, I think the post-colonial state in India is less about economic delivery to the poor, which is important because all parties have to believe that, because without that, you can't have any competition. But I think, to me, and I need to think through this a little bit, but I think is that while economics and the delivery of programmatic politics is important, that is not by itself the roots for the populist success. The populists are successful because they can criticize the existing state for not doing any of this stuff. But then what they're succeeding afterwards, especially Kejriwal and Modi, have been very good. And this is what I think the transformation that's happening is they're using technology as a means of providing the same goods to the people, but much more efficiently. And I think that's where they have managed to transform politics in an interesting way, that even the ultra-right Shiv Sena in Mumbai is now pursuing similar policies in terms of making sure that they can deliver these goods and services. So in other words, welfareism, if you will, that's what the term they use in India, is a part and parcel of all populists and all parties in India. It's just that what the right populists are saying is how well can we actually implement this. But I think their coming to power is largely because they point out to the failings of the state, that the inability of the state to actually do this, and then I will provide better services at it, and the extent to which it can. And in fact, we've documented this, that in 2019, the two reasons the BJP won was political majoritarianism, the other was welfareism. And those are the two reasons that the BJP actually managed to win its elections. The harder question is, to what extent is polarization a part of populism? And I think with right populism, you cannot separate polarization and populism. I think they go hand in glove. And this is true across the world. Left populists, on the other hand, don't think of religious or social polarization as the key to building political platforms. They by and large rely on what we would call more of a left rhetoric or an anti-capital rhetoric, or more of a state as an engine of economic development rhetoric. And I think that is true. So Mamata Banerjee, who I would call more of a left populist, eschews religious language completely. But the irony of all this, Chandana, is that both Indira Gandhi and Bhutto and even Mamata Banerjee actually start bringing religion into politics, because they quickly realize, and with Indira Gandhi, it's actually quite apparent. She starts pursuing this kind of soft Hindu politics, religious leaders, religious symbols, because she realizes that in an extremely religious society, and I think it would be unfair of me to say that neither India is not a religious society. It's a deeply religious society. And in a deeply religious society, you cannot avoid the use of religious symbols as a means of mobilizing support, especially when that can be a source of opposition to you. And I think the extent to which right populists work is they actually use that religious symbol, but they convert it into anti-minority politics. And they polarize along anti-minority lines, and the left doesn't do that. So, the short answer to your question is I think that's true for right populism. Maybe it's true for left populism, but I haven't seen any yet.
If I could, I'd actually like to follow up on a couple of the things you just said. I mean, there's so much to discuss here, and I'm aware we don't have that much time. But first, on this point about technology and welfareism, I mean, that's something I've been thinking about quite a bit myself as well, because we've seen this kind of parallel development in Pakistan as well, where increasingly technology is used for cash transfers, the provision of health insurance, and so on. And one thing that occurs to me is that this has potentially two effects, and I'd like your thoughts on that. One effect is that, in a way, it centralizes state power more by taking service delivery out of the hands of local governments, local politicians, and putting it in the hands of this kind of very centralized bureaucracy. And the second is, how does this then run up against the kinds of, for want of a better term, the needs and aspirations of local candidates and politicians who wish to seek rents, but increasingly are sidelined out of the entire business of service provision? In a way, what effect does this kind of technological centralization have on rent seeking at the local level, but also the relationship between local politicians, brokers, and party structures themselves? That was one thing I wanted to ask you a bit more about. The second thing I was wondering about was
good question. Yeah.
The future of this kind of BJP coalition, this coalition of middle classes and others who are anti-statist, perhaps socially conservative. I mean, arguably in other parts of the world, perhaps the United States and Europe, for instance, a lot of the contemporary wave of right populism we see is a backlash to a backlash. You had the 70s and statism, you had the neoliberal reforms of the 90s and the 2000s, then you have this kind of right-wing backlash to that. That's one potential interpretation. So as India and Pakistan and other parts of the world, as these populist projects by their nature are unable to implement the kind of lasting reform that deals with these questions of representation and inequality, what do you think is likely to happen to the coalitions that underpin them as their aspirations are not met?
Yeah. I think the second is a slightly easier question. The first one is much more challenging. I think the coalitions will collapse, but they'll collapse locally, as I was saying to Chandana. In other words, there won't be a large collapse, but in the Indian case, for sure, they'll collapse into the localities and the states. So I think that's what I think will happen. That's just a guess, right? I'm in the prognosticating business, in case you didn't know. My part-time job is an astrologer. No, okay. But let's get to the really difficult questions. First, I completely agree with you. Technology does centralize state power, and it makes possible, right, in some senses, that the state can now deliver these resources directly to people. Of course, this doesn't answer your question, and I'll get to answering your question in a minute. So it certainly does that, and I think that's something that's worrisome to people. And in fact, a lot of people love it. And the technology czars love it because centralization works really well for efficiency. So all the middle classes, Chandana, you and I think this is totally cool because we can get rid of all these corrupt bureaucrats and middlemen, right? And all of a sudden, the poor will get what is due to them, and the state can deliver this. And Modi, for good or bad, has actually been delivering this money to people's accounts. Now, just a little aside, what happens on the ground, of course, is still that you go to get money and you don't get the money because the local landlord or the local, in the Indian case, the local sarpanch or the local bank officer, right, will still take their bribe, will still take their cut because poor have not much resources. So they still use their naked power in some senses. And I hear lots of horror stories from people that that's happening. But that doesn't get to the deeper question you asked. And the deeper question you asked is, does this run up against local rent seeking? And what happens to the party structure, especially if the party structure is built along local rent seeking? I think that's a long and deep and a hard question to answer. And I don't think I can even begin to do it justice in how much ever time we have, or forget in 6 months or a year. Because I think that's a really fundamental question. And so the thing is, if you believe that the party system is organized around rents, that's correct. So you're taking these rents away from these folk, and you're taking the rents for these, especially these small amounts of money that people are getting. I think if you think of rent seeking as building a policy, what you're going to do is then look for alternative forms of rent seeking. And alternative forms of rent seeking may actually come where there's more money to be made, quite frankly, is through infrastructure development. So it's possible that you will now shift your source of rent seeking to some other place. That's the first thing that can happen. But I think the harder question you're asking, and which quite frankly, I don't have an answer, I can only speculate, which is, I think, let's see what Chandana thinks of this, that what would happen to party politics at the local level, especially if that's how you build. So the other thing that the Indian state is doing, of course, is giving money to local governments. And the question is, as long as you're giving money to local governments, and local governments are involved in some senses in this process, nothing may change. So in other words, you may give some direct benefits. I may send Hassan some social security money or some small amounts of money, but at the local level, to build a school, to build a road, to build all kinds of public goods, you still need. And that money is a lot more. So maybe it's just a question of money and nothing may change. But it's possible that as you centralize more and more, right, what happens then? And I think that's a really, really difficult question for us to think about, which is, will it change the nature of party politics on the ground? I should. But what way, I don't know. And I think it's a great research question. So if you have some spare time, you can go do this work. No, seriously, I think that's a great question. I hadn't thought of it. Yeah.
We're out of time, but somebody's finally asked a question that I was hoping we'd really ask about. So I'm going to use my prerogative and take that. Shruti Kirti, who's asking, does increase in women voter turnout in India have any effect on the rise of populism, if at all? And if yes, how does it affect the rise of populism? And this is, we've been thinking about the fact that women are voting differently from men. It's been visible over the last year in India, not so much in Pakistan. And if you can just sort of end on this note of telling us how we want to think about this.
I actually think the current UP elections are a big shock to everybody, where everybody says, at least the surveys, I haven't done any work on the survey data yet. I'll get it in a week or so and find out. But what has happened is that women have actually turned out in large numbers to vote for the BJP, and that's what they did last time as well. There is some argument that in the 2019 election, then as the data show, which I showed you, shows that women are actually voting for the BJP in larger numbers than they ever have. And I think there are two reasons for it. One is, this is something Modi understands really well, which the Congress doesn't understand, is providing small amounts of welfare to women that touches their home. So for example, providing cooking gas. The scheme may be a failure, but the idea is to give small amounts of resources to families that can actually make family life better. So I think that's the one thing it does. And the other thing I think it does is, of course, is that there is some argument out there, I don't know if this is right, that this time around, the fact that the BJP did really well in the elections in Uttar Pradesh was because of the promises of security that make the streets safer. And I think there is some idea that the BJP is actually purposely playing the politics of, and then I'll say something interesting from a student's work, is purposely playing this politics. There is a student at Berkeley, Anirman, who's actually working on women on BJP and the women in the BJP. And what he finds is that the reason the BJP works well with women voters is that the BJP uses the idea of seva or service. And because it uses the idea of seva or service, women are actually more engaged in that process. And they can bring women into their organization by stressing that by taking part in our politics, you're actually doing seva to the community. And he finds that that's what's going on. And I think that's an interesting and, if you will, depending on your point of view, scary thought to end this conversation with.
Yeah, and to keep watching which direction that takes us.
Absolutely,
yeah. Thank you so much, Pradeep.
Thank you so much, Chandana. Thank you, Hassan.
It's been incredible. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.